Shabbat Shalom. I think the lesson from Tisha B'Av is sometimes things can go horribly wrong, and yet we have to persevere and try to continue to build community and really just move on and grow. And so I was thinking, I wrote about the Shema earlier this week, and I was thinking about that sometimes we want to close our eyes to humanity because of some of the absurdities of humanity. But on the other hand, I look out at the group of people that are here today, the congregation, and the number of familiar faces is growing, as well as some of the names that are connecting, and that certainly is a positive thing. So this week is Parshat Vaetchanan, and it really, for me, is one of my favorite Parshaot, as I wrote, because it has so many powerful texts in it that can help us to understand Jewish life. Now, I was thinking about it because I remember many, many years ago, I was a counselor at a Jewish camp in the Berkshires, and the camp director that summer, and this was back in the early 80s, decided that he would use essays from a book, which I just happened to have on my shelf, called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. So that was the book he chose, and I've had this since the 80s, and so it's just been sitting there, although I look at it occasionally. And so he read an essay from it every week, and when you hear the essays, they sound great, and then when you think about them a little bit, to some degree, they sound a bit trite, or at least facile. And I was thinking about the one that I remember he read for Parshat Vaetchanan, and it's the one that goes with the name of the book. So he talks about the fact, Robert Fulghum, who was a minister from somewhere up in I think up in Seattle, somewhere up in, at least up in Washington State. He talks about the idea that all the lessons that we need to know in our lives, we learned in kindergarten. So look both ways, share, clean up after yourselves, and onward and onward. He has a bunch, maybe 7 or 8 different things that are lessons that we learn. And he said, if we live by these things, then we could have a wonderful world and everything would be great. And on the surface, it sounds nice, but it really is, to some degree, a soundbite, because life isn't really that simple. We have lots of engineers here and scientists. Imagine if your education stopped, in kindergarten. Well, probably we wouldn't have the capability of destroying the world right now, but we also wouldn't have many of the wonders of science. We wouldn't have been able to deal with COVID nearly as well. There's so many things that we couldn't have done because life isn't really that simple. Education can't end at kindergarten. And we need people who study through their lives and who think great thoughts and enrich us in order for the world to grow and for us to learn and to build a better and more peaceful world. Also, there are obviously the negative sides, but it does offer amazing possibilities. And I was thinking about that essay because to some degree, his point in choosing that essay for this week was, well, we have the Aseret Dibrot, we have the 10 Commandments, and that's enough too. All we need to know about Judaism, we learned in the 10 Commandments. And that's a great soundbite, just as the 10 Commandments are a great soundbite, but it's really only a beginning, not an end. If we only had the 10 Commandments, well, we'd have the basis of a society, but we wouldn't know much. It says, observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. But what does that mean? It doesn't have any details. It doesn't talk about tzedakah. It doesn't talk about peace. It really is just the beginning. It's not an end. And also, to some degree, it makes Judaism sound really simple, just as everything we learn in kindergarten makes our civil society here in America sound really simple, and the answer's really simple. And yet, is Judaism as simple as Robert Fulghum wants us to believe, or the camp director, or the 10 Commandments? Is Judaism that simple, or is it far more complex? And does that complexity give us the richness of our tradition? Now, of course, our tradition loves sound bites. So one of the things we find is the wonderful story about Hillel, where a non-Jew comes and says, give me the essence of Torah while you're standing on one foot. And Hillel says, that which is hateful to you, don't do to another. Interestingly, Hillel doesn't quote Torah, he actually paraphrases it. But he does add something after the soundbite that's enormously important. He said, this is the essence of Torah, now go and learn. So that, yes, this is a beginning, just like the 10 Commandments are a beginning, but it's not enough. Now we need to go and learn. Now we need to understand how it actually works in the world. Now we need to think about all the details to make it a much richer tradition, to make it something that encompasses our lives and allows us to affect tikkun olam. Loving the stranger is really a great beginning, but it's only a beginning, it's not an end. Just as the 10 Commandments are a great beginning, but they're not an end. Has anybody ever wondered why the 10 Commandments are nowhere in our liturgy? Well, that actually is relatively new. It's about 2,000 years old. In Jewish terms, that's relatively new. It used to be, according to the Talmud, that the 10 Commandments were indeed in the liturgy. I think some people suggest maybe in the Torah service, they formed a central part. But then the rabbis decided to remove them from our liturgy because they wanted people to remember that the 10 Commandments are a beginning, they're not an end. And that there are, for the rabbis, 613 mitzvot, and probably really a lot more than that, if we take all the commandments and all the subdivisions that are found in our Talmud and in the codes and in everything that was written since. So even that number of 10 or 613 is only a beginning, it's not an end. We need to study these and then go and learn, study some more, and make them a reality in our lives. And it's interesting, even the 10 Commandments themselves and the way that they were given is a mystery. Well, first of all, if we look at the version that we read this morning, it's not identical to the version that's found in Exodus. So which is right? Well, you know the Jewish answer. They're both right. And in fact, in Lachad Odi, we emphasize that when we say, Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad, observe and remember in a single commandment, God caused it to be. So that the commandment for Shabbat in one place begins with Zachor, and the other place begins with Shamor. And so what do the rabbis say? God mysteriously said both at once. But since we can't write that, because it would look really confusing in the text, although we do have two different sets of trope, which makes it confusing enough, but since we have both words, therefore, one place we write one, and one place we write the other. But it reminds us that the commandments, even the 10 Commandments, are far more complicated than we think. It's not just something simple. It's not something black and white where the answers are so clear that we can go to a guru and someone say, what do we do? And they can tell us exactly and give us the official answer. Instead, the tradition is complicated. Answers are sometimes temporary, meeting the needs of time and place. And sometimes answers change as we grow and move on in our development and our understanding of our tradition. And actually, the giving of the 10 Commandments becomes even more complicated than this, because the rabbis argue, what exactly did the Israelites hear when God gave the 10 Commandments? So some rabbis say, we heard all the 10 Commandments. That makes sense. And then the people say, this is too terrifying for us, Moses. You talk to God and you tell us what God said. Some rabbis, though, say that the people didn't say that after the 10 Commandments, but they heard the word Anochi, which is the first word, and then they were so terrified that they said it then, and so we only heard Anochi. But one Hasidic Rebbe suggested it was even worse than, even different than that, not worse. It was different that we only heard the unpointed Aleph of Anochi. Now, what do you think about that? That's a fascinating idea, because what sound does an unpointed Aleph make? Absolutely nothing. We heard the nothingness, the absence that is God, the mystery that's God, and then the rest got filled in. The rest was heard only by Moshe, perhaps, or maybe we as human beings added the rest as we interpreted the Ten Commandments and placed them into a human context and to human terms. We took the divine and moved it to the material. And in fact, the rabbis look at the two sets of tablets that we have, and they say exactly that. The first set of tablets couldn't exist because they were so ethereal and so divine. That's why they were destroyed. But the second set of tablets, where the tablets are created by Moses and God does the writing, those were a more material set of tablets. That was a Torah that could exist in the world, and that's the Torah we have. So again, even the idea of what the Ten Commandments are is far from clear. And the mystery of the Ten Commandments, the mystery of what Torah means, remains for us to examine and to study and to think about in all of our lives. And maybe it reminds us that when people come with easy answers, when people come with certainty, maybe that's something that we should avoid. I've always thought that if someone tells you this is exactly what God is, or even this is exactly what our tradition teaches, then you should run away from that person as quickly as possible. Because first, they're not actually telling you what our tradition believes or what God is. They're placing God in their own image and then telling us, or they're placing our tradition in their image and then telling us. So they're creating an idolatry, and we need to avoid it. Instead, we need to understand and remember that our understanding and knowledge is partial. It's growing as we grow and look at the world in different ways. It's actually why I really like the Shema, because on one hand, the Shema is an affirmation that God is one, or maybe it means that God is alone. I'm not sure. No one is. But it also reminds us as we cover our eyes to create that nothingness, that we can feel maybe and intuit God's presence and realize that it's beyond any vision, any words. It's something that we need to seek in all of our lives, whatever we do. The tradition that we have is complicated. The tradition that we have is far more than easy sound bites. But as we think about the Ten Commandments, as we think about all of the Torah, and we struggle with it and try to understand it, as we think about God and struggle with our images of God and try to understand them, I think we need to remember the words of Hillel. And what did Hillel say? He said, this is the essence. That which is hateful to you, don't do to another. But the next step is to realize that's a beginning and not an end. And what we really need to be doing is going and learning. Shabbat Shalom.